In 2014, a nutrition researcher named Jennifer Di Noia decided to chase down a question that sounds almost too basic to be interesting. Out of all the fruits and vegetables people eat, which ones actually give you the most nourishment for the fewest calories? Not which ones taste best, not which ones are trendy, just pure return on investment for your body. To figure it out, she took 47 different foods and ran them through a strict scoring system built around 17 separate nutrients. We are talking about fiber, protein, calcium, iron, potassium, folate, and the whole lineup of vitamins, A, C, E, and K. Each food was judged by how much of those nutrients it delivered inside a fixed window of 100 calories. And the results were not what most people would have guessed. Kale, the green that had been crowned king of the health food world, the one printed on tote bags and blended into every smoothie, landed at a score of just over 49. Spinach did much better, coming in around 86. Blueberries, which get talked about like they are some kind of magic pill, did not even clear the minimum bar to be included in the study at all. But there was one plant that beat every single other qualifying food. One plant that hit a flawless, perfect score of 100. Watercress. Not some rare berry hauled out of a rainforest. Not an ancient root dug from a mountainside on the other side of the world. Just a small, peppery green that grows on its own in cool, moving water. And here is where the whole thing gets strange. The single most nutrient-dense vegetable in that entire ranking is almost impossible to find in a normal grocery store today. Walk into any supermarket and you will see whole refrigerated walls dedicated to kale. Iceberg lettuce sits in stacks that seem to go on forever. But watercress? It is either missing completely or tucked away in some forgotten little corner where nobody looks. So how does that happen? How does one of the most nutritionally powerful plants on the planet basically become a ghost in the produce aisle? To understand it, you have to leave the laboratory behind and go back a long way to the crowded, smoke-filled streets of Victorian London. By the middle of the 19th century, London was the industrial heart of the entire world. Its factories were generating wealth on a scale nobody had ever seen before. But the people who actually kept those factories running mostly lived crammed into tiny rooms, breathing air thick with soot, surviving on diets that came down to bread, sweet tea, potatoes, and whatever cheap fat they could get. For the poorest families in the city, fresh produce was a luxury they simply could not stretch their wages to cover. Vitamin deficiencies were everywhere. And the illnesses that come from poor nutrition moved fast through those packed neighborhoods. But every single morning before the machines started roaring, something green showed up on those streets. Watercress sellers pushed their way through the crowds, carrying baskets stacked with freshly cut bunches. A lot of them were women and children, some of them shockingly young, walking on bare feet or in falling apart shoes across cold, filthy streets. Their calls, shouting out that they had fresh watercress for sale, became part of the ordinary background noise of the city waking up, bouncing off the brick walls in the workshops and the tenements. A bunch of it cost a single penny, and that price is the whole point, because it meant a laborer who could almost never afford meat or milk or imported fruit could still afford this. People folded it into sandwiches, ate it next to a hunk of bread, or sometimes just ate it plain on its own. That sharp, peppery bite gave them something alive and fresh in a diet that was otherwise nothing but starch and grease. The Victorians actually had a name for it. They called watercress the poor man's bread. And that name did not mean it was a substitute for bread or a source of calories. It meant that for people who had almost nothing, this little plant had become something they could genuinely count on to keep them going. Think about what watercress actually carries. Vitamin C, vitamin K, calcium, folate, and the protective plant compounds you find in the cabbage and broccoli family. All of it packed into barely any calories at all. Those workers in Victorian London had never heard the phrase nutrient density. They knew nothing about biochemical pathways or antioxidants. They just noticed that this cheap green somehow made a miserable meal feel like a real one. For a lot of families, it was medicine dressed up as breakfast. And so, long before any scientist put watercress at the very top of a nutritional chart, the poorest people in one of the richest cities on earth had already worked out exactly how valuable it was. But the story does not stay on the streets of London. To really follow it, you have to travel about 50 miles out, to the chalk streams of Hampshire, where farmers had figured out how to grow this plant on a serious commercial scale. And watercress is not your average field crop. You cannot just plant it in a plot of dirt and walk away. It only thrives in cool, clean water that is constantly on the move. So the farmers built beds of gravel fed directly by underground springs, letting mineral-rich water flow around the roots without ever stopping. That current is what kept the plants crisp, stopped the water from going stagnant, and produced those firm stems and sharp leaves that the London buyers were paying for. The harvest started before the sun came up. Workers waded into the shallow beds, cut the best bunches by hand, and packed them up while the leaves were still cold from the spring water. Speed was everything here, because watercress starts losing its freshness almost the second it comes out of the stream. And that need for speed is exactly why the railway became so important to the whole operation. The Midhants Railway moved enormous amounts of watercress from Hampshire toward London, so much of it that the line eventually earned itself a nickname. People started calling it the Watercress Line. The railway had not been built just for this one crop, but watercress became one of its most famous cargoes, practically a symbol of the whole region. When the system was firing on all cylinders, it was genuinely impressive. Watercress could be cut in the dark hours of the early morning, loaded onto a train soon after, and sitting in a London market stall just a few hours later. This was long before refrigerated trucks or anything resembling a modern supply chain. Farmers and railway workers had essentially built a farm-to-market network out of nothing but timing and coordination. And it worked for one simple reason. Everyone involved understood that this fragile plant had to move fast. For decades, speed did the job that storage never could. But as the 19th century wound down, the food system ran into a brand new problem. Cities were swelling, populations were climbing, and millions of people were now living a long way from the farms that were supposed to feed them. Fresh vegetables suddenly had to survive longer trips, rougher handling, and days of sitting in storage before they ever reached a customer. And that shift quietly changed everything, because it favored a completely different kind of vegetable. The crisp head lettuces, including the variety that would eventually get the name iceberg, formed dense, tightly wrapped heads that could take a beating far better than any delicate leafy green. Growers and distributors caught on fast. These lettuces could be loaded into crates, buried in crushed ice, and shipped across huge distances while still looking perfectly fresh when they arrived. That is actually where the name iceberg comes from. Railway cars packed with lettuce and ice were said to look like moving fields of snow rolling across the country. But the name matters far less than the technology behind it. Iceberg lettuce behaved almost like a factory product. It was uniform in size, easy to stack, hard to bruise, and dead simple for stores to price and put on display. And as the 20th century rolled on, new cooling methods made its advantage even bigger. Vacuum cooling stripped the field heat out of it right after harvest. Refrigerated transport slowed down the decay. Later on, special packaging controlled the oxygen and moisture around the leaves. Put all of that together, and lettuce could travel farther and stay sellable far longer than ever before. Supermarkets absolutely loved this. Iceberg cut down on waste, made inventory easy, and gave them a predictable product they could stock all year round. A store manager did not have to panic about selling it within a few hours. A distributor could route it through big central warehouses without a second thought. A customer could leave it in the fridge for days, and it would just sit there, refusing to fall apart. And right there, quietly, durability turned into a brand new kind of value. This was so much bigger than a change in what people like to eat. It was a change in what the entire food system decided to reward. The winning vegetable was no longer the one that tasted the best or carried the most nutrition. It was the one that survived the trip, fit neatly into the box, and stayed profitable sitting under the fluorescent lights of a store. And Watercress walked into that modern supply chain carrying just about every disadvantage a supermarket could possibly punish. The plant is mostly water. Its stems are fragile, and its leaves need constant moisture just to stay crisp. The moment it is cut from the stream, it starts breaking down. Within hours, the stems go soft and the leaves begin to droop. Even sitting in a refrigerator, watercress stays incredibly perishable. It can leave a distribution center looking healthy and show up at the store already tired and wilting around the edges. In a system built around long-distance trucking, central warehouses, and carefully planned delivery schedules, that kind of instability is pure risk. Supermarkets want three things from their produce. They want a long shelf life, a consistent look, and a supply they can count on. Watercress fails on all three. One bunch might be firm and vibrant, while the one right next to it collapses before the day is over. It cannot sit under bright display lights for weeks, and it does not forgive rough handling. Iceberg was the exact opposite in every way. Its tightly packed leaves protected each other. It could be stacked, shipped, stored, and displayed with hardly any loss. For a retailer, this comparison was not some deep philosophical debate. It was simple math on a balance sheet. A durable product meant fewer losses and steadier profit. And then the decline of the old railways made the problem even worse. Freight service on the Mid-Hants route ended in 1964, cutting one of the fastest links between those Hampshire growing beds and the London markets. Road transport gave more flexibility, sure, but it could not always deliver the speed that fragile watercress absolutely demanded. So the food system made a perfectly rational business decision that was not necessarily a healthy one. Iceberg won because it served the warehouse better. Watercress lost because it demanded speed, care, and local coordination. The system ended up optimizing the vegetable for the truck instead of optimizing the meal for the actual human being sitting at the table. We tend to judge our diets by calories, by sugar, by fat. But there is another measure that almost never gets the same attention, and that is nutrient density. A meal can be loaded with energy while still handing you very little in the way of vitamins, minerals, fiber, and protective compounds. And watercress is the perfect illustration of that gap. Like other members of the cabbage family, it contains natural compounds called glucosinolates, which break down the moment you cut or chew the leaves. One of the compounds that comes out of that process is part of what gives watercress its sharp, peppery kick. Laboratory work and small human studies have looked into how these compounds might affect things like oxidative stress and the body's cellular defenses. The findings are genuinely encouraging. But I want to be clear and honest here. That does not mean watercress prevents or cures any disease. It should be understood as a deeply nutritious food, not as some kind of medical treatment. And iceberg lettuce is not completely useless either. It gives you water, a little fiber, and modest amounts of a few vitamins. The problem starts when we mistake durability for nutritional quality. A vegetable can be easy to ship, easy to store, and easy to sell while still delivering far less nourishment per calorie than a more delicate green ever would. Over time, the whole system quietly learned to reward crops bred for size, uniformity, sweetness, and long shelf life. Bitter flavors and fragile structures became commercial liabilities, even though many of the compounds behind those very flavors are exactly what make a plant nutritionally rich and complex. The real cost was never that people started eating iceberg lettuce. The real cost was that long shelf life became the standard by which we judge almost all of our food. We traded variety for consistency and biological complexity for pure convenience. Watercress stands there as a reminder that the most valuable foods are not always the ones that last the longest in a warehouse. Sometimes the exact qualities that make a plant hard to distribute are the same qualities that make it worth putting in your body. The Victorian working class never needed a scientist to hand them a chart before they trusted what watercress could do. They figured it out by living it. When the cold months dragged their meals down into the same gray repetition day after day, when their kids started losing color in their faces, when there was simply no way to stretch a paycheck far enough to reach meat or fresh fruit, a cheap handful of greens filled a gap their bodies could feel even if they could not name it. That kind of understanding was hands-on and rooted in a specific place, and it was almost impossible to turn into a slogan or a sales pitch, which really gets at the core of the whole problem. These days we lean on labels, on rankings, on packaging and advertising to tell us what belongs in our basket. Watercress shows up to that competition with almost nothing in its pocket. It dents at the slightest touch, it goes limp in no time, and it hardly ever looks picture-perfect sealed inside a plastic container. It was simply never made for glowing displays or big promotional pushes. And still, against all of that, the plant has hung on. Dedicated growers keep producing it, and if you know where to look, you can still find it at farmers' markets, at small independent grocers, and tucked into the specialty corners of the bigger chains. A little bunch of it might set you back more than an entire head of iceberg, and there is a reason for that. It takes clean running water, a careful hand at harvest, quick transport, and a constant effort to keep it from spoiling before it sells. Now, that steeper price does not suddenly make it some kind of cure-all, and dwelling on its Victorian past should not tip over into sentimental daydreaming. What we can pull from all of this is honestly pretty plain. Convenience has quietly buried a whole range of genuinely worthwhile foods, keeping them out of sight. Nobody is asking you to reject modern farming or swear off durable vegetables, but it is worth holding on to the idea that just because something is easy to find does not mean it is the best thing on the shelf. Every now and then, the choice that would do your body the most good is sitting a little further back, hidden behind everything that logistics and advertising have taught your eyes to land on first. In the end, any system gets molded by whatever it decides to keep track of. The business of moving food around keeps score on shelf life, on shipping costs, on how uniform things look, on how efficiently they store, and on what percentage makes it to the register before it rots. All of those figures are real, and none of them are meaningless, but not one of them is the same as nourishment. Watercress was never short on value. It simply could not be forced into the mold the system was built around. It faded fast, it needed gentle treatment, and it flat out refused to hold its looks for weeks under harsh lighting. Iceberg thrived because it shipped easily, stacked cleanly, and threw away almost nothing along the way. So the plant that topped that entire 2014 ranking got quietly filed away as a specialty item, while a far weaker performer earned itself a permanent home in stores across the country. And that is the lesson worth carrying out of here. A system will always chase what it counts, not necessarily what counts the most. So next time you find yourself in the produce section, let your eyes drift past the tallest, loudest displays. If watercress happens to be there waiting, grab only as much as you can finish in a few days. Work it into your salads, your sandwiches, your soups, your eggs, and let that short life remind you not of some flaw, but of how fresh and full of life the thing actually is. It was never the lesser green. We just built a world that lost the habit of seeing it. If this is the sort of buried knowledge you would like more of, think about subscribing to the channel and coming along for the next one.